So I had intended this talk to focus on the undeniable fact that all attention to injustice is selective, and to ask how universalism, or the moral obligation to recognize the equal moral worth of all human beings, should deal with that reality. My idea was to begin, of course, with bandwidth. Even if we restricted ourselves to the publicly reported injustices perpetrated and suffered around the world at any time, including perpetrated, sorry, I'm unable to see with my glasses, but I'm going to have to hold this. A person of goodwill would quickly find themselves unable to inventory, much less to fight against or mitigate these injustices. Finding a metric by which to evaluate their relative seriousness and gravity, a metric to judge among such a heterogeneous array of injustices is a daunting, maybe impossible challenge, and as is identifying a dividing line between injustice and misfortune. But the basic point, to be frivolous in the style of Oscar Wilde, is to say a completely impartial, comprehensive attention to all injustices would take too many evenings. Limited bandwidth plus limited empathy and limited conductivity toward the suffering of other people, together, they raise the question of how much moral opprobrium we are willing to unload on people for their inevitably selective attention to injustice. Take the low-income mother who buys a pair of Nike shoes, tennis shoes, for her 12-year-old child, without noticing the fact that the shoes were produced by a 12-year-old child in Indonesia or in one of Nike's sweatshops in Asia. That's a stark case because it's not just ignoring an injustice, but it's ignoring an injustice from which she benefits. There's obviously something wrong about an international trading system that allows such a thing to happen or permits it or encourages it. But it's not a question just for her, since all of us rely upon global supply chains, which involve activities, the horrors, abuses, of which we are large, small ones, petty ones, grave ones, of which we are unaware. Now, Descartes says that the root of all irrationality is the inability to control our attention. That is, it's like the deer in the headlight, or the audience member who his attention is wandering and doesn't think about what the person is saying, is wondering if he left the stove on in the morning, and so on. So we can't control, we don't choose rationally what we pay attention to. And that's true for injustices. Some injustices stick out, they're salient, they catch our attention, and others don't, some high-profile ones. And it isn't because of the urgency or the gravity of the injustice, or the coincidence that it happens to be an injustice about which we can do something. That isn't really the reason why we pay attention to it. But the main morally troubling source of our selective attention to injustice does not seem to be so arbitrary. It is, of course, as Fenton said in his opening talk, partiality to me and mine. It's too trite really to be an insight, but we pay more attention to the injustices that we suffer and others perpetrate than to the ones we perpetrate and others suffer. There's a political side and a personal side to partiality-driven selective attention to injustice, and both points are controversial. I'll state them very briefly, and I invite your disagreement. We can see the political point most clearly if in any violent, long-lasting ethnic conflict over land or privilege or whatever, and you can choose which ethnic conflict you want. Someone who feels equal sympathy for the suffering of both sides and equal horror at the crimes of both sides is a morally admirable person, maybe even heroic person, but he or she is a rare bird, first of all, and more importantly, has no political legs. That is, they have no organized political constituency behind them to support them, to rally and to do something effective. That's not because when communities manage to resolve such conflicts, it's not because their leaders share an impartial appreciation or evaluation of all the injustices perpetrated or suffered, but it's because they share a desire for peace, which is a different value than injustice. They don't all agree about justice. They don't. So that's the political side. Personally, if we ever met someone capable of eliminating all partiality from their judgments of right and wrong, from their judgments of what injustice are the most important, I'm not sure that we would recognize them as a human being. So that, again, raises the question, how much blame can you place on people, or what kind of blame, or when can you blame someone for a partial attention to injustice? Well, anyway, this is what I was going to talk about. That was my plan. And I wanted to provoke a discussion about these topics. But then I sat down to write an introduction. And the introduction kind of got away with me. And I was following a thought process, which I was enjoying doing. And so what you're going to hear from me now is that introduction kind of expanded, which is slightly miscellaneous, slightly meandering, slightly Biden-like, I think, as I read it this morning. But it's relevant. It is relevant, even though it raises other questions too, and it's in any case different than what I planned. So here it is. More than 3 decades ago, in the early summer of 1992, just when we were finishing up our year at the Wissenschaftskolleg, my late friend Amos Elon and I embarked on a trip, a research trip, to the one and only European city that had been fully integrated into both 20th century totalitarian regimes, that had been ruled first as a German city by Hitler and then as a Russian city by Stalin, and whose fateful transfer from one to the other had been decided near here, where we are this morning, in Article 5 of the Potsdam Agreement, August 1945. We were inspired to visit the Baltic port of Königsberg, Kaliningrad, partly by our year at the Wissenschaftskolleg in the newly post-communist Berlin. You've got to remember, usually when you visit a city, you're a foreigner, and everyone else who lives there is familiar with the place. But in 1992, no one was familiar with Berlin. So it was a very unusual experience, and that impressed itself upon us. After our year-long experience of the effects on daily life of the end of communism, you can theorize about the end of history, but to live it is a different thing. It gives you a different sense of what's happening. Plus, at the presence at the Kolleg that year of the Russian Kant biographer from Moscow, Arseny Guliga, these and other common interests gave us the idea to board this Aeroflot plane where you would go down the corridor and trip because the rug was all rolled up. It was a very interesting experience of going to a place that had seldom been visited for many decades. We went to the Baltic, this Baltic exclave, to see up close how a place that had, at the end of World War II, suffered the greatest comprehensive identity transformation since Constantinople became Istanbul, how it was experiencing this latest great change, the end of communism. To set the scene and to convey a first impression, I cite a line from Amos's New York Review of Books article on our trip. Quote, "One cannot escape an uncanny feeling of the existence of the old Königsberg like the negative of a damaged photograph, lying 10 to 20 feet underneath the city's surface, covered with rubble from the war and from Stalin's bulldozers," unquote. Now, I want to say a couple things about this trip, not to rehearse the fate of Kant's birth city, which doesn't exist anymore, of course, nor to remind us of the way its disappearance epitomizes the devastating consequences of the murderous regimes and murderous wars of the 20th century, though I can't help citing, there's a great essay by Ernst Gellner on Hannah Arendt called From Königsberg to Manhattan. It's a brilliant thing, you should look it up. Anyway, this is what Gellner says. "The total discontinuity between Königsberg and Kaliningrad is the most conspicuous, blatant symbol of the delayed explosive power of the ideas of the Enlightenment." So it seems somehow pertinent here. And I'm not going to talk about it because it continues, Kaliningrad continues to play a special role in the geopolitical crisis of our time, serving as a logistics hub for Russia's homicidal rampage in Ukraine, and is also the westernmost tip of Putin's spear. And he has the nuclear-capable Iskander missiles pointed at us, basically. So it is that. That is true, and I think that in a way, gives a kind of ominous Kant-adjacent frisson to this subject. I want to, in fact, what I want to do is recall just one memorable episode from that trip, which seems at one and the same time to bring into focus a politically serious, not necessarily intellectually serious, politically serious challenge to the Enlightenment. Now, several times during these last few days, we've discussed the possible causal role. Do ideas have a causal role in history, and to what extent do they? And I think one of the best guides for me to this question is Tocqueville. And what Tocqueville said was, and this is, you'll see where I'm going here, is that even though the revolution was unprecedented, the main ideas of the philosophers were quite old. His question was, why did anti-clerical, anti-hierarchical, anti-monarchical notions suddenly catch on in 18th century France? Why were perennial ideas for the first time accepted by large numbers of people? The philosophers, the philosophers may have lit the match, but why was the straw dry? Tocqueville's question was about the straw, not the match. He didn't ask, why did philosophers attack religion? He assumed that philosophers always attack religion. But why did they find, quote, why did they find more than all their predecessors the ear of the crowd entirely open to hear them and its spirit so inclined to believe them, unquote. I cite this passage because I think it strongly supports Susan's idea for this conference. Counter-Enlightenment ideas are not new. They have been around for centuries. And in some periods, they're quite harmless. They're confined to newspaper jeremiads and academic seminars. But right now, for whatever reason, the straw is dry. And these ideas are threatening, once again, to burn down our civilization. So my story, the one I'm going to tell, and I'm trying to build up attention about what it's going to be here, is meant not only to bring into focus a politically serious challenge to the Enlightenment, but also to help explain why we, or some of us, were being naive when we saw the fall of the wall and the extension of the EU to East and Central European countries as a foreshadowing of the Kantian cosmopolitan ideal, uniting countries around respect for human rights, freedom of thought, freedom of movement, and a free economy. One more preliminary before getting to my story. When reading around, this is the build-up here. When reading around to figure out what I might say today, I came across Putin's warm support for the alternative tercentenary Kant conference held in Kaliningrad in April. The government, this is fantastic, the government announced the conference as follows. This is the government announcement of the Kaliningrad Kant conference. Russia is organizing, quote, Russia is organizing this grandiose event to mark the 300th anniversary of the great philosopher who can partly be called our compatriot. Kant accepted the status of Russian subject in January 1758, and, according to a legend, he never renounced it until the end of his days, unquote. They also cite his thesis, they emphasize his, quote, thesis on the illegitimacy of colonial rule or the non-legal nature of the slave-owning order established in the New World after the discovery of America by Europeans. Now, there's tons of things to say about that. It's worth a talk in itself. But I'm going to confine myself to one thing. By implicitly denying that Russia's occupation of Königsberg during the 7 Years' War, when Kant personally experienced what it meant to be a colonial subject of an imperial power. So it's like this is, he didn't just imagine colonialism, he lived it himself. The advertisement for the Kaliningrad conference were obviously communicating that derogatory terms like domination, imperialism, colonialism could not possibly be applied to Russia's behavior in Ukraine. Okay, now my story. I offer it as it's a parable of extreme in-group partiality, and therefore a violation, I suppose, of all of David's versions of Enlightenment and universal Enlightenment universalism. The experience has stuck pretty indelibly in my memory, I have to say. First, because it's shocking, and maybe because of Kant's joke about perpetual peace in the graveyards and so on, and also because it brought up something about the negative of a damaged photograph of the old Königsberg lying 10 to 20 feet underneath the city's surface, covered with rubble. So our guide, when we were going around talking to police chiefs and other military officials, admirals, and so on, our guide was serendipitously the architect Yuri Zabuga, who seems to be still active. He happened to be the guy who had designed the space where Countess Marion von Dönhoff's replica of the old Kant statue that had been melted down for scrap, they told us it was turned into bullets, which somehow seems poetic. I don't know if that's true. Anyway, it was melted down for scrap. It was replaced just a couple months before we arrived there in '92. And he had, Yuri Zabuga had designed, not the plinth was the original one, I think, but he designed the space in which they placed it. So that's another Kant-adjacent detail here. He told us there was one scene, one place, that we simply had to visit to appreciate the dark and disturbed spirit of post-Soviet Kaliningrad. It was in a strangely wooded area. You can't really say in the center of the city because the city was so disorganized that it had no such thing as a center. But it was within walking distance of Kant's tomb in the cathedral. We had to walk very carefully because there, every few yards, there were great gashing trenches cut roughly into the soil, maybe 2 meters long, meter wide, pretty deep. This was, as you guessed probably by now, a pre-war German cemetery. And Zabuga told us that every night, or almost every night, marauders would come armed with metal detectors and pickaxes and shovels to dig up the graves, to steal rings and bracelets and necklaces, and to use pliers to extract gold teeth. Now, in Russia, at least, in the criminal code, robbing a cemetery, a kladbische, is 5 years in prison and a heavy fine. It's a serious offense. Here in Kaliningrad, 1992, a city in which the Russian Orthodox Church had almost no presence since the war, and in a time of extreme deprivation, this is what Zabuga told us, no one had ever been arrested, no one had ever been punished for this gruesome, nauseating treasure hunt. Now, being a completely non-religious person, I was shocked by the thing, but I was shocked at how much I felt that something sacred had been violated. This is really very just viscerally disturbing. And sacred isn't a word that I usually has much meaning to me, but that was the word that came up to my mind. And I think the experience raises the question about the scope and consequences of Enlightenment secularism. Fishing, I told David about this, fishing around in my memory for political theorists who discuss the relation between cemeteries, the sacred, and the Enlightenment. Who would I come upon, of course, but Giambattista Vico, who was an Enlightenment thinker, but a friend of mine told me, he said, the difference between Vico and maybe the French Enlightenment thinkers is that instead of trying to drive out the darkness with the light, he incorporated the darkness in the light. I like that idea. I'm not sure if it's maybe those of you who know Vico better than me. But I recalled that Vico had, this is something strange, he was into strange etymologies, Rainey. He said, the genealogical origin of the word humanitas is humando, that is to bury. Okay. In a completely naturalistic archaeological account of humankind's transition from a primitive state to civilization, he dismisses the fairy tale of an advantageous contract between citizens or between people and rulers. And what he says is that burial is the original contract. Burial is the original social contract. That we know a human society has emerged from a pre-human state when we find evidence of burials. They represent the real unspoken pact among generations. Roughly speaking, we bury our parents and our children bury us. So it's a symbol of the coherence, the emergence of cohesive societies. Burial customs sealed every early humanity's sovereign domination also over land and represented the immortality not of the soul but of the family, which is why they were seen as sacred and associated with warding off the danger of losing the group's habitat. Okay, just a little parenthesis, but the picture, I think, speaks directly to what Amos and I saw that day. The Königsberger failed to secure their habitat due to the great events of the century, failed to secure their habitat by burying their deceased ancestors and relatives in the ground. And the Kaliningrazi, who were robbing these graves, who were hooligans, I'm sure, were behaving so barbarically, partly because the Soviet authority had broken down after the end of the Soviet Union, but also because they were living in a city whose cemeteries were full of someone else's ancestors. They're not them. One reason why the sacrilege or profanation, what we think of as that, was happening was that the intergenerational contract between the dead, the living, and future generations, which gives mortal creatures like us a sense of some horizon beyond our own short lives, it was not represented in the graveyards that the Russians had inherited when they reoccupied the vacated spaces of East Prussia. It's interesting to recall at this point that Kant, of course, believes in a moral obligation to treat the dead with dignity, but of course he can't explain it in an ordinary way as deriving from the respect we owe to creatures that have a capacity for moral agency. So he has a different explanation, and we'll get to that in a second. But why do we feel this obligation so strongly? It's analogous to the question you asked Susan the other day when you said, why don't you want to delete the phone numbers of your dead friends from your phone? We have this, there's a feeling of a connection which needs explaining, because we do feel it, but why do we feel it? There's at least one strand in the Enlightenment that makes it hard to answer this question, and a good example is Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson, to justify the current generation's right to throw off the dead cold hand of tradition, wrote, and I quote, "The dead are not even things. The particles of matter which composed their bodies make part now of the bodies of other animals, vegetables, and minerals." Now, that's why they have no authority over us, and we have no reason to obey them. In its cold-heartedness, this statement captures something, I think, of the callous indifference of the grave robbers. That's why it's why what we witnessed there was not like cemetery desecration that's intentional, like painting swastikas on Jewish graves. That's done in order to hurt the moral feelings of a community that honors its dead. This was more just indifference, and it was seeking some benefit. It's a kind of vandalism that says the dead just don't exist in anyone's mind, and they have no dignity that the living need to respect. The fact that we, here, I think all of us children of the Enlightenment in some way don't think that way is interesting and warrants an explanation, and one question is, how do we do that? How do we give an explanation of that in an Enlightenment framework? Now, I know that Omri Bum is going to be here this afternoon. I assume he's not here, but I can't see at the end of the room. So he's written quite brilliantly about how the Bible relativizes God and places the Kantian command, this is the Abraham story, places the Kantian command to exercise one's own moral judgment above divine authority. That's Omri's idea. That's one interpretation, which is all light and no darkness. But there's another arbitrary authority above God in the Bible, an authority that explains why we should obey God. Namely, he is the God of our fathers. We live in a house, that's the reason to obey him. We live in a house of impermanence, and we naturally try to attach ourselves to something lasting or permanent, which we can call God, or we can, in a practical sense, can call lineage and consanguinity and continuity of generations, often imaginary, running from ancestors through ourselves to our descendants. This idea is played out cruelly in the wars in the Bible, where each side wants to deprive the enemy of the consolation of being buried by kin. You want to leave them out there in the field to be eaten by animals and by birds and so on. And of course, there's an effort always to find the body of your relative and bring him in to bury. Now, Kant, no doubt, would have been appalled at what Susan would call the self-abasement of these grave robbers. But if you look, what was the basis of his insistence on the duty to treat the dead with dignity? Now, there's a public health hazard, obviously, if everyone behaved in a way that didn't treated the dead, it was, let them lie in the street and so on. So you can say if everyone acted this way, it would happen. But that's a consequentialist argument, not really a Kantian one. For Kant, I believe, and you guys, you're the experts in the audience, you can correct me, the duty to give the dead a decent burial is a specific duty, not a general duty, not a duty for all people, but for the relatives and friends of the dead, and also maybe for local authorities. So it's already a partial duty. It's a duty that appeals to your place in the world as member of one group rather than another. So if that's right, if for Kant, consanguinity and personal relationships have a strong bearing on our duty toward the dead, which seems common sense really, then I think there's an argument, Bernard Williams is one of the people who put it forward, being a bit unfair when they said that moral obligation for Kant requires us to be someone else than who we are. That doesn't quite fit with the way he's thinking, at least the way he's writing. There's a little footnote here, which I also can't help reading. Kant wrote in 1799 instructions for his own burial. And in it, he said, Herr Regierungsrat Vigilantius, would you please be so kind as to ensure, and this is very much like the Einstein form, would you please be so kind as to ensure that decent refreshments are available to members of the funeral procession? That's a kind of afterlife there. Anyway, to return to the moral squalor of treating other people's ancestors with soulless indifference, it echoes, I think, and this is, I'm being very, you can see my method is, you've already noticed, is associational reverie here. So this treating other people's ancestors with soulless indifference echoes, I think, a remark famously made by a Republican member of the House of Representatives, that's Steve King from Iowa, who says, quote, we can't build our civilization with other people's babies. So other people's ancestors, other people's babies. Savagery toward the deceased is echoed in some way toward savagery toward the young. And, you know, Trump has said that he's going to put the 12 million animals, he calls them, who are illegal aliens in the United States, into detention camps, besides having cage matches and so on. And there are several million children involved. So this savagery toward the dead, savagery, so other people's dead, other people's children. So this has something to do with that, you know, that populism is somehow associated with this kind of savagery. The relationship between identity politics and the way mass migration is perceived as rupturing the sacred continuity between generations comes up in a book that Ivan Krastev and I are currently struggling to write, which takes as its starting point Russia's identity war in Ukraine. As you might know, Ivan has been focusing for quite a time now on the causal relation between demographic panic at population disappearing and populism. Or to simplify this greatly, fear of immigration, even in countries without many migrants, is a sublimated expression of the fear that the traditional ethnic majority is shrinking due to outmigration and shockingly low birth rates. The lack of children, the oncoming demographic collapse contributes to the sense of futurelessness. Claire Massoud talked about the sense there is, what is the future? No children, no future. She spoke about that. The populist cry, we don't want other people's babies, which is the counterpart of the indifference to other people's dead ancestors, comes from a fear of the great replacement. You know, the white lump of sugar is going to dissolve in the brown cup of coffee and we'll all be gone and nothing will be left. In America, this panic is highly ironic, of course, because there was a great replacement in North America, and it was the dispossession and attempted extermination of Native Americans, the new Canaanites, whose ancestors were awkwardly buried in white man's promised land, you know. The way Ivan puts it, and this is my last point, the form of racist xenophobic populism specific to democracies hinges on a split between the traditional or historical majority of a country and the electoral majority, which is different because you've had migration, you often have a multiracial, multicultural society. Today it's different from, so the electoral majority versus the historical majority. In a normal modern country, the state is the state of all its citizens, obviously. The demos is going to be multicultural, multiracial, and emphatically, the demos is not an ethnos. The visceral, nostalgic, primitive desire for the demos to be an ethnos, embodying the perfectly this idea of intergenerational continuity, consanguinity, one people from the beginning of time, is one cause or an excuse for the anti-liberal revolt of the past decades. Among MAGA Republicans, white Americans, who sat at the top of the country's racial hierarchy since the beginning, resent what most of us, I would guess, celebrate, which is the image, the peaceful, multiracial voting line. This is kind of an image of what democracy is for us, and that's what is resented. You know, when the Republicans blamed the Democrats for basically electoral fraud, what they meant is that they encouraged blacks to vote, basically. That was the fraud, because they're not really citizens, they shouldn't be voting. So Yvonne's picture of this conflict between two majorities, the historical majority and the electoral majority, I think it does help explain populism, not merely as a war against majoritarian democracy, but as a war inside democracy about which majority should be heard, and it makes some kind of sense of that, of something all of us abhor and despise, but still is powerful. And you have to kind of understand why it's powerful, and it's related to this sense of this mythology of intergenerational continuity giving us a kind of handle outside of time. Now, of course, Enlightenment morality instructs us to resist and fight against the populist idea that the member-non-member distinction lies at the heart of the moral universe. On the other hand, since purging partiality from human motivation is neither possible nor in the end desirable even, the question is, what are we left with? Okay, so this is my very last point. Enlightenment sometimes is spoken of, but it really isn't. It's sometimes spoken of as if it was a revelation that opened itself timelessly to all rational human beings, not just to humans, but all rational creatures. But actually, it turned out it emerged in a certain time and a certain place and appealed to certain people and certain organized interests in a certain context. That is, it had its own constituency, it had its own power base, it had its own locale. It isn't just somehow, it isn't a revelation to all minds. So the question, I think for us, is why has the relative power between the partisan friends and the partisan enemies of the Enlightenment shifted in the latter's favor? And what can be done to shift it back? That's the political challenge. So that's why I disagree slightly with the sharp line between justice and power. After all, as a wise man of the Enlightenment once said, only power can check power, which means you can't be against power. And only the power of the friends of enlightenment can resist the power of those setting out to destroy it. Okay.
One minute, I'm going to take the moderator's privilege here. What did you call it? Associative reverie. That's a nice, nice. By the way, I certainly don't make any claims to having, a theory of how justice and power go together. I simply wanted to make a conceptual point between, say, the Schmittians of the world and the rest of us, or the Foucauldians of the world and the rest of us, that there is at least a conceptual difference, and one has to figure out, as a political question, not as a philosophical one, it's a political question how they work. Just a couple of interesting points I thought. When you mentioned the Kant conference in Kaliningrad, I have a wonderful Russian student, a Kantian, who the day after the invasion of Ukraine took one suitcase and went into exile. And she is following, I think you read Russian, I don't, but she has shown me the memes on Russian Twitter of Kant speaking up and saying, no, it's not me. So there's that. I had another thought or two, but let's let Kostik and David and Finton and Ben, and then I'll take another round.
Thank you, fascinating. I can't help sharing. We seem to be in Kaliningrad more or less at the same time. And the prognosis that a Kaliningrad native gave me of what's going to happen was this. The optimists are learning German. The pessimists are learning Lithuanian, and the realists are learning how to use a Kalashnikov. And the funny thing is that none of them turned out right. But I'd like to direct you back to your original subject, which is this selective attention to injustice, which, in the formulation of the title, sounds almost like a bad thing. And the more I think about it, it seems to be a necessary thing. Because when we're in the luxurious situation, there's a right and there's a wrong. Well, of course you concentrate on the injustice done to the wronged party. That's not selective. That's where the injustice is. But when you have two different victims competing for attention, you can't really take the Olympian position and say, well, every suffering is horrible and probably every suffering is it's the same way horrible, because both victims are demanding of you to take a stance. I'm thinking, say, of the Polish and Jewish competition for martyrdom, but this is or Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But it's essentially the same quandary. And it becomes even more intractable when you have two victims inflicting victimhood on the other. And of course, I'm thinking about Israel-Palestine now. And what you do is you focus on one suffering, and it's so obvious that since they suffer, the other party must be guilty and wrong. And then you focus on the other suffering, and you come logically to the same conclusion. So apart from establishing permanent residence at Olympus and looking down with condescension on those mere humans, what the hell do you do?
Does it have to be turned on, or is it working anyway?
It's working.
Okay. Great. I agree completely with that. It's the competitive nature of injustices comes from the fact that we have limited time, limited libido, limited capacities for things. We can't be torn in every direction. And then when you look, can you really ask people to be rational about which injustice to pay attention to? Are human beings capable of that? I think it's a problem for us, and you try to do as well as best you can. But it does, as opposed to saying a fight between right and wrong, when you're faced with 2 wrongs, 6 wrongs, 200 wrongs, what do? And human beings have to live in that environment with limited knowledge and not just limited capacities. It's strange. I think one example is that we talk a lot about what's wrong with the right to exclude in a nation. You have people who are suffering, and we claim a right to exclude them from our country. But when you focus on that too intensely, one of the things that happens is you're ignoring the fact that the brain drain of those countries. You're taking all the doctors from Africa, you're depleting their resources, you're doing something wrong. Now, why is it? In that case, we should be able to think of both at once, but we don't usually. So I think there are many cases like that where just our mind just doesn't have that's the Sherlock Holmes, the attic. The attic doesn't have room for more than one thing to focus on. Anyway, I appreciate your comment.
David.
No, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. It seems to me the Enlightenment is a particularly fascinating period for examining some of these issues. Particularly, you quoted Jefferson, and there's a wonderful letter that Jefferson writes to Madison in the summer of 1789 when he's in Paris, and he's observing everything which is going on. And he says, no generation has the right to bind another generation. Every generation must be to each other like independent nations to each other. And then, and then a year later, of course, you have the effective riposte to that in Burke when he says that society is indeed a contract. It's a contract between those who are dead, those who are living, and those who are yet to be born. So I guess the question is what are the rules for negotiating this? You can understand why people in 1789 so desperately wanted to be free from the dead hand of the past and from things that they felt was imposing an enormous injustice upon them that people who were dead had no right to impose. And then, but at the same time, there is this, your own sort of sense that there is a certain sacrality involved in respecting the dead, respecting their wishes. And you can and I can certainly sympathize with Burke in feeling that you can't simply throw everything out. So would you be willing to speculate on some of the rules for and some of the guideposts for working out these conundrums?
It's maybe too hard for me. I mean, it does remind me a little bit about when I was a young man, and we were always saying, don't trust anyone over 30, but, don't respect the dead. We're all going to be dead. So this is a problem about self-respect and self-abasement. We're part of that. This is part of the biological story of the human species, and the tragedy of going out of life is somehow connected with the joy of things coming into life. And we're part of this cycle, and I think there is something terrible about acting toward the past as with this kind of presentist arrogance. There's something we see that in the university, of course. That's the biggest job for the historian, I would say, today, is to teach your students that the people in the past actually were once alive. If they don't believe it, if they were once alive, where are they dead? They must have done something wrong. So I think this is also a problem intellectually and presentism, of course, is a huge saying that in the past, because everyone didn't have the same moral compass that we have, then there's no difference between moral and immoral people in the past, which is ridiculous. So I think it has this larger consequence also for history for historians. And Jefferson, he had that controversy with Madison for 30 years. They kept going back and forth and wanting to erase the past. And Madison said, you can't really do that. We depend on decisions of the past to give us some orientation so that then we can choose to focus on changing this or changing that. The idea of changing everything, that's just a recipe for anarchy. But your question was too hard for me.
Fenton is next.
That was a terrific talk. Really loved it. Thank you. And of course, I couldn't help thinking this is very obvious stuff, but about Antigone, and it seemed to me that the connection between the two parts of your talk is about limitation, and what are the limitations on our imaginations, our moral imagination, and a different sense of imagination. Because, of course, that's exactly the question which is posed in Antigone, where Creon, who's the state, quite rationally, I mean, he's not a bad guy, right? So for very good reasons. I mean, they've just had, an invasion. Bodies are still everywhere, all over the place. And he makes a distinction, right, between two kinds of dead, the two brothers. There's the good brother who fought for the state, who is to be honored and given proper burial. And there's the bad brother who was the traitor, whose body, as you say, is to be left out for the dogs. And there's lots of imagery of the dogs and the birds and all that. It's very vivid in the play. And Antigone says, you don't have a right to do that, right? And so it's setting up, very early in this history of Western thought, this question of what are the limits of rational moral choice on the part of power, and what other kinds of duty or imagination might come into play. And it's fascinating that you raise this in relation to Kant. I didn't know about that. That Kant also thinks about this in a way, which is, and struggles to say, because if you're only using a certain kind of rationality, there is no rational reason to bury the dead. Right? There's nothing. Yes.
There's hygienic reasons.
Yes. So the only rational reason is an animal one, right? It's not a human one. It's
right. You have to bury animals too.
Yeah, sure. But for the sort of idea of proper burial, of ceremony, of memory, those are other kinds of demands, aren't they? And so, what seems to me to be at play here is that there's, as you say, there's a moral bandwidth which we have, right? That we cannot infinitely extend our sympathy at the same time to everybody. But in the other fields, we say, actually, it is infinite, because we can extend it to the biggest human group, which is the dead, right? They vastly outnumber us. They extend way, way beyond our memory. And so it's counterposing, perhaps, a different sense of obligation to the one that we live with every day, which is, and I suppose that the reason for going back to Antigone here is because it's something we haven't really talked about over the weekend, which is that the Enlightenment is not just about writing, it's also about dramatizing and playing, and so much of the Enlightenment, the philosophical thought is not extricable from artistic intervention. There are other ways of thinking that are absolutely central to.
Well, that's what it gives them
all of
theater
them.
on.
Yeah,
Saturday night.
yeah. I mean, they're writing plays, they're writing novels, they're telling stories in other ways, because sometimes, maybe, the arena, the artistic arena, particularly the dramatic arena, is one in which we experience live the necessity to extend our moral sympathies towards people we don't like. And, so the moments in a Shakespeare play where we watch Macbeth, for example, murder, send his thugs to murder a child. We see the child on stage. He's the nicest kid in the whole history of literature. He's lovely, he's really funny, he's really smart, we get to really like him. And then they murder him in front of us. And then the next scene we have Macbeth, and we feel sorry for him. Because he's there, he has this beautiful language, and he's, and so it's testing all the time. And this is happening in drama, it's happening in novels, it's testing this capacity that we have, which is disturbing to us, actually. Sometimes that the limitations on our moral sympathies seem to be quite a good thing, right? So we shouldn't have sympathy for monsters, but in art we often do. So I suppose it's just that maybe there are different senses of limitation at work here, and that the artistic is linked to that, what Antigone appeals to, which is a deeper, irrational, but nonetheless potent and imperative force to say, no, you cannot impose limitations on our obligations, including to the dead.
Well, that was very beautiful. I mean, just a couple. Well, first, a question about, is the only happy marriage in Shakespeare Macbeth? Because I think it has to do with the family and the state and so on. Anyway, no, so you have other people we don't know, but then there's family versus state.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very big one, and a good example of this, and I would say it's a strong liberal principle, that, and it has a complicated history, but the way it's turned out is that spouses have no duty to testify in court against their spouse, even though you have really a pretty total duty to support your state, your government. But you don't, because there's something different. But the family has a different status, maybe something sacred about it. And a good society doesn't do that. It doesn't draw that into and put it under the pressure of the state. So I think that's the Antigone.
How long has that been a rule?
Well, the problem
Did they
was,
take it from Antigone?
No, the problem was that originally it was you don't trust women. So the whole history is complicated, but
They're in a power relationship, the patriarchy.
yeah, for sure. And it's a whole complicated story. But I think it's the way it's ended up is this idea that the family relation is something that you shouldn't be violated. And because it used to be only the wife couldn't testify against the husband. He would decide if she could testify or not, and so on. But it wasn't reversed. She couldn't decide if he testified. Anyway, I didn't want to get into that. But today, what it means is this, that there's something about the family that's outside the authority of the state, and I think that's kind of an Antigone story there.
Yeah.
I have Ben, the gentleman whose name I don't know. China, okay. And then Leah, Rainey, and Cave.
I'm still on the theme of dead and buried people. For some reason, I've been reading dystopian novels about what happens after nuclear holocaust in the spirit of looking at hypothetical societies and Enlightenment plans. And I came across an Aldous Huxley novel called Ape and Essence, which opens with a post-nuclear destruction society opening up graves in search of clothes that are in good enough condition to keep wearing. And I think the clue there is that for him it's a breakdown of the social order. It's an opening sequence to show a desecration of graves in a casual way. And I'm wondering whether this question of the dead and of continuity is something that links us away from the Enlightenment now, in the sense of trying to understand why the enormous condescension of posterity must be brought to bear on all previously existing societies and all societies that we are not interested in building because we're interested in policing thoughts in a very interesting way. It's not a very coherent thought, but that is.
Yeah, I think this sort of relates to the earlier two comments that politically throwing off the dead hand of the past, that's fine, and you can say they don't have authority over us, but that doesn't really tell Susan that she can't keep these phone numbers in her phone book. That is, that would be a kind of violence to us. So I think that's right. So politically, these things, what it has to do with public-private difference and so on. That's like the spouse exemption rule. That's very, very strong, and we wouldn't want. And then, of course, the question is, what about the communities? But really, going back to Kostik's point, we can't look at every problem in the world, every suffering in the world, and we're going to be limited. And it's pretty natural that we're limited to those who are related to us, who we know, who are around us, and it's often unfair and unjust. Sometimes it's really even despicable what we do. But and there's one other point about this. This I think is an important reflection that in a society where there's a rule that you must be impartial towards suffering, we create institutions which make it seem like we are. So a hospital can look like it admits everyone, has an emergency room, but once you are sick or you have been injured, something clicks in which is called inequality under adversity. So there's a danger. People, unlike the liberal mythology, society does not consist of individuals. It consists of well-networked and poorly networked individuals. And you go into the hospital and you have good network, you call the director, you call your friends, you get first-class service. People who don't, who are a black kid who's shot in the head, he dies in the back room. But it doesn't appear. So what the norm of equality does is it's an incentive to create institutions that make us comfortable with actually a hidden inequality. I think that's another aspect that's more realistic about how it isn't that the norm has no effect, but the effect isn't the norm of equal treatment. It has no effect, but the effect is to create these illusions.
Heiner, over here. Elise.
Thank you for this rich lecture, and I wanted to make a point about your story on Kaliningrad and the cemetery. It brought me to mind a concept of enlightenment which is quite ambivalent. The concept reason which starts with zero. That is, I think, not the core of enlightenment, but this idea didn't come up before the Enlightenment. Reason which has no history, which now makes everything new. What Hegel stated for the French Revolution, they wanted to start a new state and begin with zero. And I think the cemetery reminds there always is a prehistory. And that brings me to mind the problem of tradition. Before the Enlightenment, in religion, tradition is always an authority. The argument is made by tradition, and it was sometimes stated by medievalists that in the Middle Ages there began a kind of enlightenment when the Christian scholastic, and I think the Jewish scholastic as well, said it's not only faith, it's not only authority, but reason.
And Islamic scholastics, as we heard at some length yesterday. So I'm going to have to ask everybody to keep their questions short because there are lots of people who'd like to
Sorry,
speak.
just only let me finish this point. Reason in this way is answering and listening, and that's the problem with, I think, how to install such a kind of reason after the Enlightenment and this effect up to now of thinking we begin with zero. This relationship was my question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's very good. So,
began with
okay,
zero.
again, year zero and all that. But it does remind me, my dad, as he was getting older, used to tell me, he said, it's great, I meet new people every day, because he always started from zero, you know. And that at my age, I'm also experiencing that. So, okay, that's great. We'll talk about this later, Rainer. I agree, that idea, that's an extremist idea of the year zero starting over, which of course was unstable, didn't work, couldn't possibly function, because the past sets down roots in people. You can't get rid of them. I mean, you can burn them, and well, Kaliningrad is an example. What does it mean to really burn down the past? Just look at that, the way that place looked. Well, you saw it, Ghosty, in 1992. It was horrifying. It was the ugliest place on earth, I think.
There's competition for that.
Okay.
Rainey.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. My question is about the role of empathy. I absolutely agree with you about limited bandwidth, limited attention, limited resources. But I look somewhat Pollyannishly at those few examples where historically it has been possible to extend our sense of to whom we owe justice, to remain with the theme of the remains of the dead, the restitution, for example, of the remains of Native Americans and other peoples that had previously rested in museum collections. I don't think that's based on empathy, nor do I think it should be. Empathy is a very important human faculty, but it is not ipso facto a title to justice.
Is it based on lobbying? What is it based on?
It's
I mean,
based on a
apparently
recognition.
The inhabitants of Constantinople don't lobby anymore, so you don't have to restore anything to them. They don't exist. Or, I mean, there's so many groups in the past that had no present lobbyists, so therefore we don't restore anything to them.
Right.
So
Agreed about the politics. The point is only that I don't think it's necessarily or should be
I like your point.
about empathy. It's a respect for this as a community and a community to which something is owed on the basis of justice. And I think you see the limits of empathy when you look at the movement, the abolitionist movement, which is initially founded, once again, on empathy about suffering, and that has its limitations. Okay. It is not full recognition.
I agree completely, but I think there's a limit to respect as well. I don't
I
think
had-
you get the idea that respect is unlimited. We don't do that. We do it very selectively. It's different than anything.
Well, I wanted to throw in one thing, although I've been trying to not stop anybody else. But when you mentioned, I forget who it was, who said the dead are not even a thing.
That's Jefferson.
Jefferson, okay.
Particles of matter.
Yeah, particles of matter. I was actually wondering, and I don't know if Kant says this anywhere, maybe Leah or Philip will know, aren't the dead a perfect example of what it means to be an end in oneself, and that therefore treating human beings as ends in themselves does mean burying them in some
Good.
sense?
Okay, I like that. There's something there, but they're not moral agents. They don't have the capacity.
No, but end in itself is not really about being a moral agent. It's about certain things that you can and can't do with them.
Moral status.
It's a moral status, something.
So this actually follows quite nicely, because I was thinking about the relationship between our obligations of care to the dead with the obligations of care to future generations, so to the not yet born. And what I really find it hard to think about is, if we care about the dead as ends in themselves and as part of their membership in the human species, you'd think the same reasoning that we apply to our care and thinking about the dead would also apply to future generations. But it seems to me we actually are, well, I don't see any evidence that we are as motivated to act for the sake of future generations as the way we are motivated to act for the sake of the dead, even though the dead themselves are not there and they don't care, and in some ways, actually, we are doing it for the human species. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this.
Well, yes. So, first of all, future individuals, we don't know who they are. The dead, we sort of do know who they were. So they, it's like the difference between the past and the future is that the past has details and the future doesn't. So it is a different world to relate yourself to. Obviously, this is our problem, that is not paying attention. The indifference to this is, in a way, it's a crime against the future. So why is this?
We know a lot about conditions under which they're likely to live if we do various things.
We do, but you know the life story of your parents, and you don't know the life story of your great-grandchildren. So
we owe the dead.
We owe the dead? Okay. Uh-huh. Because they created us? I see. And we don't owe our great-grandchildren. Yeah, that may be part of it. But I think, okay, thank you. That's a great point.
Okay, Leah, Kaveh was next.
Yeah, many thanks. So while you were talking, I was reminded of, I think it was Hartley who said the past is a foreign country. But I wanted to say something else regarding your notion, if I understood it correctly, on justice and your assumption that justice is mostly selective. And I was wondering if that doesn't kind of ontologize or is a kind of essentializing transhistorical understanding on justice, because of course, depending on the specific socio-economic and cultural conditions that we analyze, these things can be very different, right? You do have situations, persons where they actually do try to take things into account in a way that is more attuned to totality and be impartial in the true sense of the term, although it's always an approximation. And I was wondering if that isn't a very specific, rather static understanding of human nature.
I mean, I haven't ever experienced anyone like that. I did a lot of interviewing of jihadis in French prisons. And one of the things you first notice is they have a very strong idea of injustice. That is Algerian War. They even will talk to you about Sarkozy and Strauss-Kahn, and they're all the French. They have, if you try to say a word about their own crimes, they think you're just attacking Islam. That's not a sense of justice at all. So they have a very strong, antagonistic concept of injustice, which is completely opposite of the system that imprisoned them. And in some ways, they have some right on their side. I would say, as an outsider, I'm an outsider. I could see both sides of this. But that actually shows that I have no influence on the situation. Only an outsider could do that in that case. I mean, no one can see every form of injustice, but individuals who are not political players, who have no political influence, can, in a contest between two groups, can see both sides. It's just that a person like that has no political influence, because that's the nature of impartiality and politics. It's just not a thing, unless you've got a social agreement on peace as superior to justice. That I agree. But I wish there were more cases like that. And of course, we know individuals who can do it. We know individuals, and we admire individuals who can be impartial in that sense among two groups, Israel, Palestine. We know individuals who can do that, but you don't know a political party that can do that.
Charisse.
Yes, thank you. You just helped me understand a book that I've been working on that I had introduced in my talk by Alice Behrendt, a writer who wrote a history text on the genealogy of German national identity. Uh-huh. She wrote it in episodes that were put together as a collage. And two elements that she presents side by side is Kant's last will, his testament that you read from, and the will of Amschel Rothschild. And they're just placed next to each other. And I was wondering, why does she do that? You just explained, because in Kant, what he's provided for are his friends and employees, all of whom are mentioned. And the Rothschild will is about descendants and family members. Wow. And that's where she doesn't explain, but there they are side by side. Yeah, and I think you've given us the skeleton for that. So, and the way I understood Finton's comment, that this ability to respect sites for the dead is the original universalist impulse. It's the place in which we could actually possibly expand our attention to equally to all, because they're not demanding much of our attention other than just respecting the boundary. And so I just wanted to invite you to think more about, well, why did we bury them in such a way that they could be desecrated? You know, if cremation were the general practice, then that universalism would be preserved. So just to speak about all of the various ways in which we bury the dead and the consequences that come with those practices.
Okay, so this is a huge topic, but it's definitely, at least in Vico's theory, and that relates to this idea, there is something universalistic about burial. It's like humanity, this is how humanity was created. So it's the species, in a sense, rising up out of the muck into civilization. That's the thing. And I think even now in Neanderthals, they're looking at Neanderthal burial sites, and they're finding burial things, very primitive things. And it looks like that's already a cohesive society in some way. So it has a universal element, but you assume it's really the kin group that's doing the burying. It's not something. And I think for Vico, at least if you take him as a guide, I don't know if that's worthwhile, but for him it was, you bury in a way that can be desecrated because you're making a claim on the land. You're not scattering the ashes on a river. And you're trying to, lay your claim to this territory. So one of the reasons, not the only reason, but the American colonists brought over black Africans is they had a problem with the American Indians, because the American Indians had ancestors buried on the land. So they had a claim to the land that was deeper than theirs. But black Africans had nobody buried in the land, and so you could shift them around and you could treat them much more like they're just instruments. So then after some generations, we buried our people here, so now it's really ours.
That's really interesting. I should say, the last conference organized by Misha Gabovich before he left the Einstein Forum was called The Dignity of the Dead.
Oh, really?
And I wish you had been there, because those are thoughts that would have been useful as well. But all our conferences are now, thanks to the pandemic, available online on YouTube. Yeah, right. Philip, did you want to add?
Just two very small points. So my instincts are always to try to find more options when I'm faced with a dilemma. I thought it was crucial to your story that the desecration came in the form of people just coming along and tearing things open. We can imagine, in Ben's example, for example, the community turning this into a rite and forming a festival in which the dead give up their clothes willingly to the living, and they are venerated for doing so. We can think of a way to get beyond it. And I also felt that when you replied to Leah, you were too quick. We don't respect the dead because we know their stories. Their stories are, in a sense, irrelevant to that. It's more basic than that. And when we look towards the future, when we think about their lives, we don't need to know their stories. What we know is that there are going to be limits on the stories that are told about their lives that were not attached to the lives that we are now living. And that then should produce in us a feeling of debt and obligation towards them.
The Iroquois actually did unbury their dead as a rite.
Oh, okay, good.
And it is quite fascinating.
I was actually thinking when we're moving Irish dirges, mournful songs, Willie McBride, where actually the person sitting at the seminary, standing at the cemetery, is precisely asking, we have no idea who you were, none whatsoever, and asking a set of questions, but nevertheless being, it's terribly in mourning, right? So
The unknown soldier, but people do visit their relatives' graves, Philip. I mean, they don't visit cemeteries out of generic.
There actually are
respect
people
for the
who
dead.
do.
Yeah, okay. We all know strange people.
Problem. It's one of the favorite pastimes. It's walking around cemeteries.
Yeah, sure, it can be nice.
Cemeteries, that's something that tourist attraction.
Yeah, sure, famous, sure, and Montparnasse. Yeah, but they're going to see Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. That there's where you go when you go into Montparnasse. What do? You walk around? No, you look at Thomas Becket and you come on. They're people you know. They're people, and future generations aren't. I mean, they will be people. And they should be respected. And it's a huge problem in a way politically. It is the problem, trying to preserve. If we don't get this right, that's the end. If we don't preserve the planet for them. So, but of course, as I said, we don't attend to things because they're more important. That isn't the way human mind works. They attend to things for other reasons, and but you can fight to make them attend. That's one of the things political activism is about: drawing your attention to things that you tend to not look away from.